I thought I'd just say a couple of words in introduction. I always think that Somalia sort of falls into two phases. There's the bit that, I think that's him, the bit that everybody agrees with, and those are the kind of basic facts. I mean, you have the Siad Barre overthrown in 91, many years of no government at all, and then 13, 14 different attempts to try and establish a government. Finally, in October 2004, you get a government elected or selected, or however one wants to put it, in Nairobi. Abdullah Yusuf elected and immediately says, well, I'm going to go off to Ethiopia and get my 20,000 troops and come back into the country. Everybody in Somalia is completely gobsmacked as far as I can see. And he ends up with not a huge amount of support amongst a large number of people. You then get the two-government situation where in the middle of last year the Islamic courts take control of Mogadishu, and of course you have the transitional government then being outside the capital, based outside it. This is of course resolved then at the end of last year with the Ethiopians coming across the border, a short but fairly brutal campaign, and now the Ethiopians in Mogadishu having established by one means or other some kind of control, and the African Union having put in a small 1,600 strong Ugandan force which is or isn't doing very much. So I mean those basic facts are generally kind of agreed on. The question is, how does one interpret them? And that is the difficult bit, because you can have on the one hand there's the interpretation which says the Ethiopians were invited in by a completely legitimate government which had the backing of the regional powers, which had the support of the United Nations, and that they invited them in, and well, they were only doing what any brotherly state would do and assisting the government. The other view, of course, says exactly the opposite, that the Ethiopians imposed themselves on the country, that they were the enemies of the Somali people traditionally, and really they have done nothing but cause bloodshed and misery and have flattened large areas of the capital. So, there are two totally different views of exactly the same set of circumstances. And the role of Al-Qaeda, the influence of terrorism or not, depending on how you look at it, these, I'm sure, are the issues that we will be looking at in the next few minutes. What I'm going to try and do is ask all the speakers to restrict themselves to 5 minutes. We'll start with Mohamud Gure, but since he's the only Somali on the panel, we'll perhaps be a little bit generous with the 5 minutes, but beyond that I will be a Leninist and ruthless. So if you don't mind, Mohamud, if you wouldn't mind beginning.
Okay, thank you. I just told him before that I'm a Somali, 5 minutes is not enough, so basically, thanks very much. Basically, I had slides to show you, PowerPoint pictures to show you, to share with you about the situation in Mogadishu, but unfortunately I was told the system is not working tonight, so I cannot show you that. But what I could tell you is basically give you an overview of the current situation in Mogadishu. As you probably all of you know, there were fightings in Mogadishu between 29th of March and 1st of April, and then 17th of April and 28th of April. Those fightings have killed more than 3,500 people, mostly civilians. Displaced over 500,000 people. Basically destroyed 10 square kilometers of the northern districts of the city, Mogadishu, and also destroyed or partially damaged at least 6 hospitals, schools, universities, mosques, industries. So there was an indiscriminate and reluctant use of heavy artillery, tanks, multiple rocket launchers in a heavily populated city. Everything that the Ethiopians had, they used on the city, and just try to kill everybody or destroy whatever comes in their way. So the situation today we have is a humanitarian crisis in Mogadishu, where more than half of the displaced people are still still sitting under the trees in the outskirts of the city. The aid that was coming has been several times blocked by the TFG, which said that they need to investigate and see what's inside the sacks of rice or beans in that, which would go into the victims of their making. And the situation is getting worse. On the other side, the insurgents who are fighting against the Ethiopians went underground today. They increased their bombing and execution of government, transitional government officers or officials in the past few days. Only Tuesday, another city in central Somalia, the first time it started outside Mogadishu, an operation which have destroyed 3 Ethiopian vehicles and killing a number of Ethiopian soldiers. So the situation, the security situation in the country is deteriorating. It hasn't improved since the Ethiopians come. So what we see is a prolonged civil war, which is run by many people think it's the remnants of the court. Well, it's not the remnants of the court. It is the remnants of the court, yes. And also there are nationalist parties. There are clans who are fighting against the Ethiopians. So all Somalis, most of them, are determined to remove the Ethiopians by force if they don't go out by themselves. So everybody is determined to remove them by force. And we basically think the war will continue. The insurgency will continue as long as the Ethiopians stay in there. So what is the alternative? How do we go from here? The situation is getting worse. Also in Kismayo, the tensions are very high. There could be a renewed fighting. In other parts of the town, of the country, there were also fightings. So how do we, how do we take care of this situation where the Ethiopians are detaining people, where the militias of the transitional government are looting, carjacking, raping, and killing people, detentions, including journalists. 3 journalists with satellite television of Universal were held 48 days in prison without charges. So these things happen every day. So how do we stop this? And how do we improve the situation? What is the way out of these current morals? So and also war crimes were committed. The Ethiopians used excessive firepower to destroy Mogadishu and kill people, maim others, and displace thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands. These war crimes, which the European Union has recognized, and which all international and local human rights agencies have recognized, and need to be investigated. So the victims of those wrongdoings of the Ethiopians need also to be investigated, and the truth to be exposed. So these things are all needed to be looked at and looked into. And how do we get out from here? So basically, I don't want to take all the whole time. Basically, the way forward probably will come into the questions, I believe. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohamud. Let me bring in now, if he's on the line, Richard Beer. Richard, one of the things that I'm very aware of is the role of the United States in this action. I was told, sorry, Robert, I was told by somebody who was well informed that 3 days prior to the Ethiopian invasion, he was informed that it was going to take place. I just wondered whether what light you can throw on this.
Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Good. Thank you for inviting me. This has been part of the Bush administration policy, was to defeat the Islamic courts in Somalia. This was done what we call covert action. Most of the covert action has taken place without informing Congress. It has gone through private organizations, democracy funds, direct military aid to Ethiopia, counterterrorism, CIA funds going to Somali groups that oppose the Islamic courts. This has been
say that you say there's not much evidence. I mean, you say there's not much evidence. I mean, are you sure about that?
I get most of my information about the Islamic courts from people, North African governments, in particular Libya, who has accused the United States in diplomatic talks of mischaracterizing the Islamic courts and claiming that once the Islamic courts were overthrown in Mogadishu, that they are under a threat from these disparate groups which are closer to bin Laden. They were more optimistic about the Islamic courts taking control of Somalia and making better connections that would ultimately prove to their benefit. What's happened in the Bush administration is that they cannot, any group, they don't understand. They've tied to bin Laden. They're doing this in Gaza as well.
And what do you think the United States is trying to get out of this?
I think that this is part of what they call, the democracy. It's been reduced to that. We are trying to turn back a tide of Sunni extremism, which in fact is spreading, especially after the war in Iraq, and we're trying to put our finger in the dam. I don't see any evidence this is working. You don't see it in Iraq, and all these movements are connected in one way or another, but ideologically, not organizationally.
I mean, do you have a sense that the Bush administration gave the go-ahead to the Ethiopian action?
Absolutely. I mean, what has happened is that the CIA has been displaced in many senses by the military, and many of these covert actions have been given to the Joint Special Operations Command, which has a mandate to destroy Islamic regimes that are believed connected to bin Laden one way or another. This is, again, reduced to the war on terrorism. And what you get out of this is normally when the CIA is involved in covert action, it has to be authorized by what's called a finding. And the finding is written by the White House and is given to Congress. Most of these findings could not get through Congress, and therefore it stays within the Pentagon. Even today, after the departure of Rumsfeld in Iraq, Lebanon, and other parts of the Middle East, as well as North Africa, including Somalia, you see the military taking up a role that was traditionally held by the CIA.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Richard Cockett, you've just come back from Stuttgart, where you've been briefed by EUCOM, the European command of the United States. Is where they operate and deal with most of Africa. Well, they're not actually the Horn of Africa, strangely. So, but what did they tell you? What did they give you? What kind of insight do you have from there?
Well, yes, Stuttgart is the headquarters of European Command, where they divide the world into several what they call combatants commands, and out of Stuttgart they run what's just been mentioned, the special forces operations for the whole of North Africa. They haven't got absolute responsibility for Somalia, but they knew all about it. And I can just give an overview of that and perhaps piece it into the diplomatic context very quickly, in a sort of essence of why we should worry very much about what happens in Somalia now. Because basically, since these Ethiopia invaded, or was invited in, at the end of last year, the big problem now for the West and for Africa particularly is that it's risking sucking in not only the neighbours, most obviously Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and of course there's Eritrea, but also the United States more heavily than it's been involved before, and also European countries as well, who are now also being encouraged to commit forces against the war in terror in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Now we know that, of course, in Somalia, Eritrea has been using it as a sort of proxy war against Ethiopia. The Americans have persuaded the Kenyans and the Ugandans to sort of cauterize the borders of Somalia so that their terrorists can't escape. They're very worried about infiltration down the coast of East Africa, down into Kenya, down into Tanzania, down into Zanzibar. All this stems, of course, right back to the bombings of the American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998. And a lot of the American interest in Somalia centres on 3 al-Qaeda suspects, particularly Fazal Mohamud, supposed to be the mastermind of those 1998 bombings, the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. And he particular was the person they tried to take out at the beginning of this year when they sent in, you may remember they sent in 2 C-130 sort of bombers to try and get him at the end of the Ethiopian campaign to depose the Islamic Courts Union. So they are very worried about that. The Americans are now persuading and paying for Ugandans and the Kenyans to help them in Somalia. And they are also trying to enlist wider diplomatic support in an effort to further isolate the remnants of the Islamic Courts Union in Mogadishu as well. Just going on very briefly to the vital thing here probably is what sort of threat exists. And if we can establish that, then we could begin to think about the question of proportionality. Has the Ethiopian and the American response to what's happened in Mogadishu is it proportionate, or is it out of all proportion? You know, if you're just hunting 3, probably 1 al-Qaeda suspect, is that justification for a lot of the mayhem that has gone on in Mogadishu? This is an extraordinarily difficult question to answer. Yes, there is probably one al-Qaeda operative, or at least 3 of them. But what's happened, as I'm sure we'll be discussing more, is that after the collapse of the Islamic Courts Union role, their armed wing, the so-called El-Shabaab, has mutated into a genuine al-Qaeda organized terrorist cell now. Intelligence officers reckon that there are probably between 500 and 1,000 of these people operating now in Mogadishu. That's a problem you have now, and you did not have before, particularly the Ethiopian and American invasion. So in fact, in terms of the threat, it's probably been increased in terms of the aggressiveness and the anti-Western nature of it since the invasion. And just very briefly to end, when I went to Stuttgart, of course, they're concerned with the problem across the whole of North Africa. They're looking at all the Islamist terror groups in Algeria, in Tunis, in Morocco, in Mauritania, Niger, Chad, Sudan, right down to Somalia. So they see this as one complete and seamless theatre, most sharp, if you like, or most worrying in Somalia at the moment, but it's part of what they see as a general trend across the whole of the Sahel and the Sahara, worse in places like Algeria, and it could be worse in places like Mauritania and Chad. They're now infiltrating special forces teams, 12 Navy SEALs or Green Berets, teams of 12, into the Sahel in Mauritania and Chad to try and work and train up local forces to take on organizations like Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which came out of southern Algeria last year, to try and stop them spreading across the Sahel and perhaps linking up with Somalia. So that's the current American interest, why they need allies across the whole region, and why they're particularly worried about Somalia.
Thanks very much, Kim. Roger. Thanks very much, Richard. I'll get there in the end. Kim, may I ask you, you've been to Djibouti, you've seen the American operation there, and you also know Mogadishu well. What would you like to say?
Well, first of all, Richard got much more in Stuttgart than I got in Djibouti, I should point out. That's where the Horn of Africa Task Force is based. But most of the people who knew what was going on, i.e. the Americans, and at that time were planning what came afterwards. refused to see me, so I had no great scoop, I'm afraid, from Djibouti at all. I am no expert, I hasten to point out, on Somalia, as you may be shortchanged with me being here. I have been to Mogadishu a few times. I got there first just after the Islamic courts had taken over, and we met some of the leaders, Sharif, Owais, and the rather scary Hassan Iro. And I've been back there since. Just a couple of points, we write in the newspapers and it's broadcast that Somalia is another Afghanistan or another Iraq. In my submission, that's not the case. It's got its own internal dynamics, which you all know about more than I do. It certainly isn't Iraq, and I've got Haider al-Safi, the very fine Iraqi journalist here. We spent a lot of time in Baghdad together. I can assure you that what's happening in Somalia is not Baghdad. But what is interesting, I found, were patterns of American behavior in Somalia and the Horn of Africa, which replicated the way they behaved in Iraq and to a certain extent Afghanistan. The same desire on the part of the Americans to do things in black and white, to have clear-cut villains, to believe people who they thought would be natural allies and who they should have known have their own agenda in saying to the Americans, what they did. And this kind of, this myopic behavior I found quite surprising, because you'd think that have learned, especially in Iraq, not to the dissemblement of people who have got their own particular axe to grind. I remember someone Mohamud knows very well, Chapel Engineer Ina, who's a businessman in Mogadishu, who owns part of the port there, I don't know what 17 part of the port there, and he tried repeatedly to get the Americans to speak to the business community in Somalia, speak to public figures in Somalia. He went to Nairobi, met the American embassy there. He offered to take them to, I think he actually went to Djibouti himself, where he took a delegation over, and the only person who saw him was an Air Force sergeant. So it is not surprising, but still very sad that the Americans failed to grasp opportunities which were there before the current conflagration began. The only other thing I'll say is the media reporting of Somalia. There's an upsurge of it. You have some rise in interest from time to time. Then you see headlines saying the refugee situation from Somalia, according to certainly one UN official, is worse than Darfur. I don't know if that's true or not. I find that difficult to believe, but it certainly is a pretty dreadful situation. And yet there has been, as far as I can see, very, very little media focus on Somalia. I'm not sure why that is, but I think, as my colleagues pointed out, it's a problem which you can't ignore. You can't just shove aside, because I think it's something which will affect us or infect us all.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you all. May I just check, Robert, let me get your name right. Are you still on the line?
Yes, I can still hear you.
Oh, excellent. Well, since that connection seems a bit dodgy, let me just begin by asking people who would like to put a question to Robert. We don't often get the opportunity of asking a former CIA operative something directly. Who would like to put a question to him now? Is 1, 2.
Hi, yes.
Just
Robert,
introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name's Gavin Rees, and I'm a freelance journalist, amongst other things. Robert, it's a kind of slightly strange question. We just have this idea has been introduced, is that there were lessons to learn from Iraq, and it looks like they're not being learnt in the Horn of Africa. So why is there so much difficulty on building on past experience?
Well, let me say right away that this war in Iraq has been an utter disaster, and it's been an enormous unsought boon for what's actually happening. And there's also a denial in the law in the United States that Israel is the center of this problem. They do not understand that Muslims look at Israel as an American colony, an extension of the United States, or the West, if you like. And once you deny this central fact of what's happening in the Middle East, you can't deal with the facts. They don't understand the facts. It's likewise, they do not understand that Iran is winning across the Gulf, that overwhelming political superiority will defeat overwhelming military power. It's the lessons of Vietnam have been completely lost on this administration, and Democrats as well.
Well, thanks very much. Just one more question to Robert, then we'll throw it open at the back.
Thank you. I'm Mary Harper from the BBC World Service, and I wanted to ask whether Robert believes that not only is the US policy towards Somalia now a self-defeating policy, but right from the very beginning, the fact that CIA agents are reported to have funded warlords to create a so-called anti-terrorist alliance to defeat the sort of nascent Sharia courts actually led to them becoming something far more powerful than they would have been if the Americans had just let them get on with establishing security in certain parts of Mogadishu.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I've sort of had an inside track on Negroponte's visit to Tripoli, and the Libyans told Negroponte that you have completely destroyed, and I've just said this to you, you have completely destroyed our opportunity to make the Islamic courts into something legitimate, acceptable to secular governments in North Africa. This is a Libyan take. But remember that the general who put this policy into place, General Boykin, was a evangelical Christian who really did believe that anybody that was not accepting American ideology or a secular government was anti-American, and it was really was put in those very stark terms. And I think our opportunity to create a legitimate, peaceful government in Somalia was destroyed by the American administration.
Okay, let me just throw the floor then open to people who want to ask more general questions or put a point. Yes, sir.
Matteo Willis, independent filmmaker. I'm interested in to know what the panel thinks about the Middle East's involvement in Somalia. This seems to be the invisible elephant in the room. A lot of goods, in particular weapons, have travelled from places like Dubai. Also a large amount of money on both sides of the TFG and the Islamic courts, and they seem to have a big influence in the region. Also a large amount of finance comes from Saudi, whether from the Somali diaspora or from sympathetic groups within the Middle East. How much does that have an effect on Somalia, and what is being done to moderate that effect by people like the Americans?
Okay, Mohamud, would you like to begin that?
Well, I think there are two issues here. One is the Somali diaspora sending money back to Somalia, to their relatives and families. That is an ongoing process since the Somalis escaped from the onslaught of the beginning of the Civil War and resided in Europe and North America. So that's still, I do send money to my mom every month, so that's very usual. So most of the money that goes to Somalia is sent to relatives, basically. What goes to the Islamic court is, because Islamic courts as such, today as an organization, they don't function. The leaders are now in exile in Asmara. So basically, those who are fighting in Mogadishu today, which are partly the remnants of the courts and partly nationalistic elements who are also, with the cause because of the Ethiopian presence in Somalia. They do get support from some people from outside, yes, and also some people from inside. And most of it is just it's not a lot to trace. It's not like thousands or millions. It's like £100, £50, £10, things like that. So it's very, very difficult to trace that kind of money. But the transitional government basically relies more on what the Ethiopian government provides, because transitional government is just exists by name. It's basically Mogadishu is today run by the Ethiopian general who's called General Gure. He's the commander-in-chief there, and he's the president. So basically, the transitional government is politically, not independent from the Ethiopian domination. And whatever they want, they go through the Ethiopians to get from the Americans or from the EU or whatever. So they use the Ethiopians to get it. But I don't think there are many people who send money to the TFG to do things.
Kim? Well, as you point out, both sides got lots of weapons, lots of funding from a variety of interested parties. Certainly, when the first time I was there, the Islamic courts had just taken over, and at that point there was a lot of Saudi money coming in, some of it for reconstruction, but with the proviso that the schooling would take place in Arabic. And you began to see the Saudi who arrived preaching the use of the wearing of the niqab and things like that. So there are interested parties all along, and of course it's the it's sort of alliance of convenience with the Eritreans supporting the Islamic courts and the Ethiopian supporting the TFG. I mean, there have been various reports written on it. I don't think there's any shortage of weapons in Mogadishu. When I was there, the main market, I forgot the name of it, you tell me, you could buy
the market.
Yeah. Kalashnikov for $100. The places are awash with weaponry, and of course the Americans were funding, funding the warlords, as someone else pointed out. But that's bound to happen. These places now become the cockpit for all kinds of underlying tensions and competing interests, and I just don't see how that's going to change, I'm afraid.
Richard?
Well, only to confirm, yes, that so did you say there was a UN report which was quite good at the end of last year, where they detailed exactly the countries that were trading, giving weapons and money to the Islamic Courts Union and to the other side as well, and Eritrea featured very heavily, as did Yemen, Saudi Arabia. You can get it on the UN website, and it's a pretty good report. I've been told that the Al-Shabaab, the fighters, the remnants of the Islamic Courts Union, are getting about $3 to $4 million at the moment from Middle East sources, and so they are being funded, and quite heavily funded.
Who are those sources? Are they Middle Eastern? We talk about Middle Eastern sources, but are they Somali businessmen, say for example, based in Dubai, who have been involved with the arms trade, particularly sugar traders and things like that? Or is it Wahhabi groups within Saudi, for example, that are then using that as a platform to fund operations within Somalia?
We're not quite sure. I mean, all I know is that it comes from a variety. The Yemen, for instance, quite some money comes in from the Yemen, and also apparently Yemenis have been turning up jihadists as well, allying. So there's human resources going into the Al-Shabaab as well as money. And this is one of the alarming features of the situation there at the moment. It is sucking all this in and involving more and more people. So it's a sort of maelstrom, a sort of imploding centre, sucking in neighbours, people over on the other side of the Red Sea, money, and as far as I'm aware, nobody has traced the exact sources of this money yet, but it's a range of what you've mentioned, plus individual, plus more organised terrorist groups further afield, and probably in North Africa as well.
Robert, can I just ask you, what do you make of the United Nations report? It was very detailed, gave the times and dates of landings, particularly highlighted the Eritrean role in supplying arms and transshipments through to Somalia. You are very critical of the United States role, but do you deny that you think the UN got it wrong in what they were saying? I think we've lost him. Sorry about that. Well, perhaps Mohamud, do you want to respond to that?
As far as for United Nations report of the last year, I think it was not the way I see it when I read it. It was not credible at all, because some of the reporters said there were 720 Somalis who fought in Lebanon. And how could that be? Somalis cannot hide in Lebanon, can they? I mean, there's no way. So basically, you could see, I mean, the report was very much biased, and it was based on more or less to what the United States government wanted to hear and to sell to the rest of the community. So basically, that report was, I mean, to me, was totally, not a good report, and I would totally ignore it.
I
would agree with you. I think that it is.
I think there's a lot of substance in it.
Yes.
And it detailed the arms sales and finance to both sides. It was not just peddling the American line. It was highly critical, a lot of countries, and lots of people breaking their own embargoes. That was the point. I mean, there is supposed to be, and still extant, as far as I know, an arms embargo, astonishing, on Somalia. And the UN took all these member countries of the UN to task for comprehensively breaking the arms embargoes on all sides. I think it was...
I agree. I must say, when you read the report, it does have a ring of authenticity about it. I accept what you say about Lebanon. That was a strange element in it.
Not also that. They also said there were 2,000 Eritrean soldiers in there, which were not true at all. I mean, the Eritrean influence in Somalia...
But everybody's picked those two elements out of the report and said, well, you must therefore dismiss the rest of it.
No.
Sometimes you've got to be careful
of
that.
The 2,000 is right, but nobody... well, maybe you will deny, but as far as no concerned observer has denied that there have been Eritreans in Somalia. Call them military observers, trainees. There have been one, probably hundreds, not 2,000, but they have certainly been there.
Anyway, we don't want this to become an internal debate. Yes, sir.
Tom Fenton, do we know how much direct American military involvement there was in the invasion? Is it just intel, or was there command and control, close air support, insertion of some special forces? How much was there?
Who'd like to take that up?
Well, just very, very briefly, in my limited experience and limited knowledge, there was certainly command and control, there's certainly intel, there was some air support, and I was told that there was certainly 3 or 4 occasions when American Special Forces were actively involved on the ground in Somalia,
in the south.
In the south. But I was told in a very limited role, and basically looking for specific targeted individuals who they failed to find, and kill some others instead. But there were certainly American boots on the ground, and I've been told that by the Americans.
I mean, the one other thing which seems pretty clear is that when some of the warlords were defeated by the Islamic courts, that they were evacuated from Mogadishu by the United States. And I mean, there's no secret the United States has been operating in the Ogaden, in the Somali region of Ethiopia. From time to time there have been clashes. This has been documented. So I mean, there certainly has been some operation in the ground, and I certainly agree with the idea of intel. Beyond that, certainly I don't know, but I wondered, is there anybody else who wants to come in?
Well, there were 2 airstrikes carried out by the American Air Force in south of Somalia, particularly in the south of Kismayo, where
let me just stop you for 1 second. I think we've got Robert back on the line. Can you hear us?
Yes, we got cut off.
Oh, excellent. Well, we'll bring you in a second. Please go on.
Yes, there were 2 occasions where American airstrikes, killed at least 70 nomadic families in southern Somalia, between Kismayo and the Kenyan border. And that was reported and actually verified by Oxfam and other aid agencies who were at the Kenyan-Somali border at the time. And also there was a landing of at least, they say, 200 US personnel in that part of the country. But basically at the end they withdrew. They couldn't find one of the suspected terrorists which were looking, was basically said was around in that area. but they did not find one.
Robert, I just wanted to bring you in. There was a question from the floor, was about the actual involvement of the United States in a direct fashion, you know, boots on the ground. I mean, what is your information about that?
Well, there were special forces advising and in direct combat.
How many? I mean, any idea?
In the hundreds.
In the hundreds. And this was over a concerted period of time, or just at the beginning?
It's been over a concerted period of time. It also involved reconnaissance, unmanned aerial vehicles, intercepts, intelligence collection, but more than that, advising.
And do you think that's an ongoing role?
Excuse me?
Is that an ongoing role?
It's an ongoing role all over the world.
Well, that's pretty definitive. Somebody else? Yeah, the gentleman at the back's been trying to come in. Oh, sorry, right.
Hi, Mike Haskins. Having said about the 200 alleged Somalis in Lebanon, to what extent do you think that elements or supporters of the courts who are more Al-Qaeda affiliated are involved internationally in other sort of Al-Qaeda type like operations, maybe in Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan or elsewhere? They provide any sort of support or personnel, anything like that?
We've come across very, very few Somalis in Afghanistan or Iraq. I mean, I can't recall, to be honest with you. I really can't recall, coming across many. In Iraq, you do get, of course, foreign fighters. You get the Syrians, Jordanians, Yemenis, Saudis, Pakistanis. In Afghanistan, you do get Pakistanis. You get a few Iranians on the west. But I mean, it's an interesting question. I could well be wrong, but I can't recall my colleagues or I coming across certainly any significant number of Somalis in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Mohamud?
I haven't heard or read any story saying a Somali person was caught in Iraq or in Afghanistan. So if there were cases, I think we would have known. I mean, the media would have written like the other nations, for sure. Basically, Somalis are known to be more culture-oriented and have more allegiance to the clan rather than religion. And because of that, and for the past 15 years, Somalis, even though there was no central government, even though Somalia was ripe to be manipulated by Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups, it did not materialize. And there is a report by Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, USA, which says Somalia in the past, Somalia proved to be, even though the atmosphere is ready for Al-Qaeda to utilize, it still failed like the way we failed. So basically, Somalia cannot be utilized because the clan is more stronger, and anybody who goes there cannot hide within the clan unless you belong to that clan. So it will be difficult. But this time, having Ethiopian forces in Somalia, having the Ethiopian force killing Somalis, raping Somalis, and looting their property, I think at this moment, it's probably much possible to have Al-Qaeda to infiltrate in Somalia and come in and get a hideout. It is more dangerous now than it was in the past 16 years.
Okay, there was one gentleman here who wanted a question, then I'll come over to you. Yes, that's right. Oh, sorry, I didn't see her. I apologize.
It's either of us. Michael Walls from UCL. You've made a very convincing case for how the US in particular has taken a difficult situation and made it worse by not learning lessons from Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever. I'm wondering, on a more positive note, what lessons you feel could be learned from the Somali territories, that have successfully achieved a degree of reconciliation and stability, particularly Somaliland. I think there are lots of elephants in the room. That's one of them.
Okay, Somaliland. Who wants to talk about Somaliland? Anyone?
I could just say a word about lessons learned, perhaps.
Yes.
Because we've been talking about a lot of, have the Americans learned lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan in Somalia, probably not. But I was struck by talking to the American Special Forces who deal with the rest of North Africa. They won't really admit it, but they learned some very hard lessons, not only from Iraq and Afghanistan, but from Somalia as well. So what they're trying to do in the rest of North Africa is to prevent weak countries, fragile countries, from lapsing into a sort of a state that Somalia got itself into in the early 1990s, i.e. they're trying to be preemptive in their action to prevent failed states, rather than to come in at a later stage and try and fix it when the situation has become unfixable. And they'll even give you kind of lots of very nicely coloured bar charts showing how much less money you can spend in, say, things like boreholes, what we would call the application of soft power. Is distinct from how much you've got to spend that on military hardware when a regime has collapsed and you want to try and make it better according to your own terms. And so what they're doing in the Maghreb, in Mauritania, in Chad, etc., is inserting these special forces, but they're inserted with borehole drilling equipment as well as M16s. And they will tell you, and I'm going to go on an embed with them and find out whether this is true for myself later in the year, that they will spend most of their time drilling boreholes in very remote areas, building schools, building roads for local communities in an attempt to win hearts and minds. And I will say to them, this sounds very much like nation building, which is of course the terrible bête noire of the neocons. And they'll sort of and ah in a bit, but that's sort of what they're doing and spending quite a lot of money on it. The idea being is that you win the allegiance, or at least win part of the allegiance of the local people, who will then not be so prone to follow the lead of, say, Al-Qaeda and Maghreb when they turn up, offering perhaps water, transporting trucks, etc. And that is a lesson they have learned from particularly Afghanistan and also from Somalia.
Robert, do you think that the United States is going to recognize Somaliland?
I think they will. They're going to have to. I'd like to add something. This is tangential. Right now, Washington is consumed by Iran, and the neocons understand that they're going to have to make concessions, compromises in large parts of the world, with the exception of Iran. As you know, there's a task force that has moved into the Gulf, and I was astounded to learn that the military did not inform the State Department when this 17,000-man task force moved into the Gulf. I think that the neocons, in particular Cheney, would like to solve something with Iran. You can think the worst, and I certainly don't know what the plans are, so that you will see in Somaliland, other parts of North Africa, you will see a lessening of U.S. involvement while it focuses on Iran. And it is all connected.
Yeah. Thank you. Kim?
Just very briefly, if you go to Hargeisa, they will tell you, they'll complain bitterly that they're not being recognized. They'll point out that it's one part of what was Somalia, which is relatively stable, and they've been trying, as you know, for a long time to get recognition, and they haven't. And as an outsider, you do feel a certain amount of sympathy, for them. But then, of course, the bigger picture is: do you really want a balkanization of that part of Africa? So, from one part of Somaliland, on the surface at least, it appears to be a relative success. So, purely on that term, they do appear to merit recognition internationally.
Okay. I've been told that this lady's been waiting a long time, and since we haven't had a lady ask a question, please.
No, actually, it was more a comment to the Arab interference with Somali politics. And I think Arabs have been interfering with Somali politics for a long time, from 1985, if not longer. And I think by denying as Somali that the Arabs are trying also their way in to that part of the Islamic world, it won't help as much. And I must say, although I'm from Somaliland, it's very sad to see that the Western world is choosing dictatorship rather. Actually, there's two ideology fighting you can say in East Africa, and Somalia is part of that war. That is dictatorship against you would call it Western will call it Islamic fundamentalists, but actually the people in Mogadishu were suffering for a long time, and only support they used to get for the last 20 years were from Arab world, and it was they used to help with schools, they used to help with a lot of stuff, while Arabs are too busy winning the hearts of minds of people. Westerners are throwing guns, and this is so sad for those of us in the Islamic world who want to see enlightenment in that part of the world. So I would, my question is more, do we have to choose as liberals in East Africa or elsewhere in the Islamic world for a dictatorship to fight Islamic fundamentalists? That's my question.
That's a hard one. Who wants to tackle it? Or should we just leave it hanging? I'm not sure it's a question we can really answer.
Well, I think historically, the Americans have, as you know, long supported dictatorship in Latin America against the perceived enemy at the time, which was Marxism. So it's not particularly surprising if you look at the track record in Chile and Argentina, Paraguay, where they supported fascist leaders against the common enemy as they saw it, which is communists. Now, the common enemy as they see it are Islamists. So, historically, it's not surprising at all that the Americans should be backing a new set of dictators against who they see as a greater threat.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Absalom Gure, my name. I'm from Somalia. My question is we see last couple of days that Ethiopians raised their flag in the headquarters, actually presidential palace in Mogadishu, where is the base of a transitional government now, which they call embassy. And does that going to change the attitude of United Nations and the US? Does it going to sound like Ethiopians are acting like kind of like American in Iraq, like Green Zone, trying to, to establish some kind of an authority down there?
Well, one interesting point that's emerged in the last couple of days is the Ethiopian foreign minister arriving in Somalia, basically saying they are not going to pull out very soon, which is quite a change from the remarks that were made right in the beginning in December when it was going to be a very short operation. But anyway, that's my response. Anyone else on the panel? Yes?
Well, yes, they've been claiming all along that they will leave immediately, and the Ethiopians will say they've withdrawn thousands of troops already, but considering what's gone on in Mogadishu in the past couple of months, I doubt that can be true. One thing to say here, we haven't talked much about Ethiopia, of course. There's an important dimension here that this is a solution. The whole of the Somalia thing is also part of a solution to Meles Zenawi's own domestic problems. He used to be what we call in the past an aid darling of the West, feted by George Bush and particularly Tony Blair, and he became a huge recipient of Western aid up until the 2005 elections, presidential and parliamentary elections, which were disputed and badly flawed. And in the aftermath of that, on 2 separate occasions, the police shot dead scores of protesters in the streets of Addis Ababa. And since then, he was very rapidly frozen out by the West, particularly Britain and America. And it seems fairly obvious that Ethiopia has very sourced this as an opportunity to re-engage, particularly with America and Britain, to curry favour with the administration, to join them in the war on terror. And that's what they've been doing in order to alleviate domestic pressures and the international isolation that had come on after those disputed elections. So as long as they keep to the American line, that's very good for Meles Zenawi. And so that's probably a pressure on him to keep engaged in Mogadishu for quite a while. And to add one thing, of course, again last week, when the Ethiopians were saying for public consumption, we want to pull out as quickly as possible, the Americans immediately went to Addis Ababa and said, no, you cannot pull out at all, because that would create a security vacuum. And it's exactly what they said to the Ugandans as well. And so with American backing, and presumably with American money, they are going to stay in there until the 7,500 AU soldiers are going to arrive, and I don't think they're ever going to arrive.
Yes. The one thing that's happening now is that NATO is supposed to be sitting down and checking on how they're going to airlift anybody in. But let me take another question. Yes, Yusuf.
My name is Abdulrahman Wassam. I'm from Somali Concern Group. My question is, all day we're talking about America. What about the British government role in what's going on in Somalia? Particularly, I'm interested in diplomatic support for Americans. We know that next week, probably next Tuesday, we'll have international contact group on Somali meeting in UK. So anyone can enlighten us on British government role in what's going on in Somalia.
Well, since Kim's a diplomatic, let's say, correspondent, what have you heard?
Well, to be perfectly frank, I don't think the British government has got any great interest in Somalia at all. It doesn't really come into their radar much in any significant way. I think if the humanitarian crisis gets even worse, I think you may well see a greater engagement. You do hear from British diplomats in Nairobi and also in London that they disagree with the way the Americans have approached some of the problems in Somalia. They feel there should have been greater dialogue with the Islamic Court, to at least their supporters. But when it comes to effective action, I don't think Somalia is despite the presence of a very large Somali community in the UK, and maybe that's partly, if I may say so, the fault of the Somali community, that they haven't been lobbying hard enough. As far as the UK PLC is concerned, I haven't come across much interest from the Foreign Office or Downing Street, I'm afraid.
I must say, I would certainly personally just agree with that. And, one of the things that's quite striking about the Somali community, and this is just a remark, is its lack of penetration of the political process in Britain. I mean, how many Somali councillors are there of any political party? How many? Two. Right. Are you one of them? Oh, right. But I mean, that is really appalling, given the size of the Somali community, which, I don't know, 100,000, 200,000, a very strong community, and yet almost no representation. I think it's a real problem in the way that people interact. Anyway, this lady wanted to have a question.
My name is Amal, and I'm Somali. My question is, how much is grouping the problem of Somalia with the overall problem, like the war on terror, the clash of civilization, has belittled the Somali problem, which existed actually probably far longer than the Iraqi war or the Afghanistan war, and how much is that hindering any solution that we might have had, and who is the winner of the current situation? Who are the winners?
Do you want to? No. Who wants to come in here?
Well, I'm not sure the belittling is quite the right word I would use. In a way, I suppose you can say that Somalia has become inadvertently a player in this great game now. It is, whether you like it or not, perceived as a chess piece in the war on terror. Not just from the point of the Americans, as my colleagues said, there's a lot of arms money coming in from all kinds of countries. And I think in the current situation, it's kind of globalization of conflict that is almost impossible to opt out, especially in a country where Islam is somehow involved. So it's unfortunate, if you like, that Somalia wasn't allowed to get on with itself. But I'm afraid the situation as it is now, it is the globalization of conflict, and I don't think any of us can opt out, sadly.
Robert, would you like to come in here with giving us an American perspective?
I think I'll pass on that one.
Okay, fair enough.
Can I just say
yes,
one thing?
sorry.
Yes, I mean, very quickly, sorry. So, but you touched on a very interesting point, you see, is that it's now got caught up in the war on terror. And the problem is that the West, particularly America, now projects a quite recent phenomenon onto Somalia, as though Somalia has no history pre to 9/11, which is a problem all around the world. And of course, there's Black Hawk Down, and so the whole Black Hawk Down episode in 1993, that's become part of a narrative on terror. Suddenly they make up oh God, they were terrorists then too. Wow, that's what was happening then. And so, and the thing is that this lets them off making any very serious investigation or acquiring any deep knowledge of the place, because you can just put it on a box as terrorist conflict, Al-Qaeda operative, right, that's part of the global war, and okay, we got it all sorted. And that's very dangerous. I mean, it's terrible in Somalia, and you can see it all around the world. And these guys, when they think of a place like Somalia, it really is bad guys. Occasionally there are some nuances. There are bad guys and there are very bad guys. And there are good guys. And and that's sort of it. In the way that special forces operators, who now have a great deal to do with Somalia, think. So I think you touched on a very good point on that.
If I may come in, it's just surprising that when the courts emerged from Mogadishu, I mean, the Ethiopians started, calling the courts as Islamic fundamentalists, Islamic terrorists, but the U.S. never called the courts Islamic terrorists. They never called them, and they never considered them as as terrorists. But as an Islamist organization coming up in the Horn of Africa was a threat, and in the geopolitical setup of the Horn of Africa, because that could undermine Ethiopia, which has more than 65% of its population Muslims, and also Kenya, which has a large Muslim population. So in a context of strategic interest to the U.S., I mean, the courts have to be stopped. Basically, that's where the Americans were coming. But as far as the Ethiopians are concerned, it is exactly what my colleague said. Because Meles Zenawi was in a very, very bad situation at the time, and the transitional government did not have any recognition at the time. It was recognized in June. Right after the courts conquered Mogadishu, they were recognized. The transitional government got a recognition. Why? Because the Ethiopians can use its legitimacy to invade Somalia. So basically the invasion was a setup, which, if I may go back a few years back, this was a plan set up in Sodre, a small town in Ethiopia in 1996, where Meles Zenawi, Abdullah Yusuf, and Isaias Afewerki of Eritrea decided to install Abdullah Yusuf in Somalia and give him 20,000 soldiers. So basically, even though the Afewerki and Meles are not together, the Ethiopians are still, implementing or executing the plan which was set up in 1996. That's where the Ethiopians come in.
Okay, let me take a couple of quick questions then, because we're running out of time. This lady and one here, and one there then.
Okay, I had a meeting, I attended a meeting at the
What's
Foreign
your
Office. My name's Hodan Yusuf, sorry. I attended a meeting at the Foreign Office which was supposed to be contact group with the Muslim community when this was flaring up last year, around the time of the C-130 airplanes bombing the civilians. And I put it to them that there was a report in the Sunday Times around the same week where SAS troops were reportedly helping physically on the Kenyan-Somali border, British SAS, and there was no denial from the Foreign Office as to their physical involvement. My question is that the extent of the special relationship? There was an impression given from the officials I met that Britain would have liked to have a more hands-on approach when the Islamic courts were considered to be a possible power. They could have subdued them, as it were, but that boat was missed. That was the impression I was given. And is America's involvement and determination, perhaps this is something Robert, if he's still on the line, could come in on, linked to the fact that there's vast resources of uranium and oil in Somalia, as well as strategic position?
Okay, let's just take the other two questions. This gentleman.
My quick question
Whoa,
I'm coming in, sorry. Is if the Democrats win the 2008 election, are we expecting any policy change towards particularly Meles Zenawi and his war on terror?
Okay. And the one at the back.
Returning to us on the point.
So, what's your name, please?
Sorry, Peter Salisbury. Returning to your point earlier about generalizations made throughout the entire of this talk, we've heard about Al-Qaeda, terrorism, and the war on terror, which are all very rhetorical. But something else that we hear constantly is America and the Americans. To what extent is that rhetoric, and who else, through involvement or non-involvement, is complicit in what's happening here? Because we're looking to one nation and one administration, but surely, in terms of the UN, in terms of everyone that's involved globally, other people are involved, be it the Brits, be it, I don't know, Australia, I know, has a strong involvement in Africa. Who else is complicit, basically?
Okay, I'm going to now go around the panel. If you want to come in and answer the specific points about uranium on oil, policy changes or Al-Qaeda and who else is involved, let me begin with Robert there. If you're still on the line, what would you like to come back on?
Well, I'd like to answer the question about what are the Democrats going to do, assuming they're going to get the White House in 2008. I spent a lot of time with the U.S. Congress, in particular the Democrats. If you haven't understood my allegiance so far, they are fairly well cut out of all decision-making on Iraq in terms of the surge, in terms of what's going to happen with Iran, covert action in Somalia. As I said, they've taken most of this covert action, taken it out of the purview of the CIA, put it in the Pentagon. The Pentagon is not talking to the Democrats. As this administration runs out its time, 17 months. Oil is very much a secondary consideration to Iraq, to the war on counterterrorism. I see there's a prevalence in Washington that, for instance, the Gulf is secure. They don't look at there's problems in Saudi Arabia. They don't consider the argument that individual Saudis, fundamentalist believers, if you like, are supporting fundamentalist groups in North Africa and Somalia. So we're very much, in the United States, going to need a new president to change direction. I just don't see any changes between now and then.
Well, thank you very much. Richard, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to knock off 3 points very quickly. I disagree a little bit with Robert about the significance of the 2008 election. I think it will be very significant, particularly for Ethiopia, because despite Bush's newfound support for Meles Zenawi, the Congress has passed motions condemning Meles Zenawi's human rights record, condemning the shootings, the aftermath of the 2005 election, and they've actually voted money for what they call democratic activity in Ethiopia, which, of course, the Ethiopian government condemns as supporting subversion against the elected government. But the Democrats in Congress will say spreading democracy in order to have free and fair elections. If a democratic president gets into office, see more of that, expect a cooling on Meles Zenawi, and that might really alter the dynamic in the whole region, but particularly between Ethiopia and Somalia. Another quick one on, just to go back to the Somalis here, political organisation here. I must say, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a very low level of Somali organisation here, and that's very dangerous, I think, and sad for the Somalis, because, of course, all the terror types, or rather the anti-terror types, MI5 particularly, they're busy drawing all the links between Somalia and the bombings in London 2 years ago. Both times there were Somalis involved, and they've been involved as witnesses in the terror trials here. So again, there's, in the absence of any countervailing force from an organised political representation, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes of, oh my God, you know, it's the incubus of terror nurtured in Mogadishu spreading to Britain. And so... Sorry?
So when you said that in London's bombing, there were Somalis linked.
Yeah.
So were the Ethiopians?
No, I mean, absolutely right. But in the absence of an organised lobby here by Somalians, the problem is that all these links don't get challenged very much, and all the soft thinking, basically, oh God, Somalis as failed state terrorists, oh my God, and they're all in Britain, oh, they're all must be terrorists. That sort of thinking is allowed to grow. And just very quickly on the soldiers, I mean, Kenya is the British Army, one of the British Army's major overseas training grounds. Kenya, Canada, and Belize. And there is always a healthy British military presence in the middle of Kenya. So I would say I know nothing about this as a concrete fact, but it would be entirely unsurprising if British forces in Kenya were somehow involved in at least helping the Kenyans to cauterize the border with Somalia.
Mohamud, I'm going to come to you last, but give you, since you came first. Kim, what would you like to say in summary?
Oil. Yep. If you recall, the original name for Operation Enduring Freedom in Iraq was Operation Iraqi Liberation, OIL, until someone in the Pentagon realized that's not a good idea. But are all American actions governed by need to get hold of oil? I mean, I personally don't think so. I think that's rather a one-dimensional approach to it. I think, you know, they've got lots of other threats as they see it. So undoubtedly, you know, if there's uranium and oil in the Horn of Africa, they'll help themselves to it. You know, look at the scramble for all that going on in the Congo, for example, with, you know, lots of countries involved there. So that's wouldn't surprise me. The question of British involvement, as Richard points out, you know, Kenya is a big training ground for the Brits. There's certainly Brits in Djibouti. I've met them, you know, part of that team, who you know, part of the Horn of Africa task force. What part they played in the operation in Somalia, I've got no idea. The thing with the Special Force, the SAS, SPS, is that they do try to use almost everything as a training exercise. You know, and wherever they are, you know, I mean, that's the way they are. So I wouldn't be surprised, like Richard, if they were involved in the Kenyan border at all. But going back to, sorry, further point you made, did the Brits have a different view? I think we've said before, yes, they did have a different view. They did think there should be more dialogue with the Islamist courts, but were they prepared to get involved, or rather, let me rephrase that, were they prepared to get, you know, go that step further in Somalia? The answer is no, because really Somalia isn't of huge interest to the British government.
Thanks very much. Mohamud, the last word goes to you.
Well, thank you. As to the point of oil and gas, uranium, yes, Somalia is rich. It has a lot of it. And I can quote Chevron employees back in 1981 when they first found the oil, and even before that. So Somalia is rich, the oil is there, everybody knows that. And one could say that one of the reasons that the US took the courts out is there was a suspicion that the courts, if they become powerful, may invite the Chinese to take over, just like the Chinese are now in Sudan. So basically it was a prevention more than, or preemptive, as you might say, for the Americans. So basically the oil is there, the uranium is there, even though today the reason the Americans are around Somalia is they're not guarding the oil, but they're guarding more on the uranium, so that the Iranians do not filter it in Somalia. So basically, there's a continuous surveillance in Somalia by U.S. Air Force, day and night, in Somalia, all over Somalia. So basically, that's that. As for the courts, there was a good chance between June of 2006 and December of 2006. There was and peace talks going in Khartoum, Sudan, where the courts and the TFG were supposed to reach an agreement, a political negotiated agreement to form a broad-based national government. But that was hindered by the insistence of Ethiopians that the courts were terrorists, and America's reluctance of not pressuring, or even the EU did not play a positive role to push both sides to reach an agreement. We could have averted this war if that opportunity would have been, pushed forward. But unfortunately, because of the naivety of the Islamic courts, of what was coming out, and also the greed of Mele Zenawi, and also the complacency of the Americans and the EU, we have the situation we have today. We have a very terrible situation in Mogadishu, particularly after the war, after the fightings of last month in April. And more than 500,000 people have been displaced, and over 3,000 people were killed, over 10,000 were wounded, and hospitals were destroyed. So all that war crime needs to be investigated. This is what we need now to know, because Mele Zenawi is now accountable to what has happened in Mogadishu, because he gave the orders, and also the leaders of the TFG, Abdullah Yusuf and the Prime Minister Ali Gedi. Those people are responsible of the atrocities and war crimes that has happened in Somalia. And I would plead to the human rights groups to start investigating this very important issue, which is justice for those who were killed sleeping in their homes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mohamud, Kim, Richard, and Robert. Thank you all for participating, and thank you for all your questions, and particularly thank you to the Frontline Club, which organized this event. I'm sure it won't be the last time that we deal with the subject of Somalia, which is obviously a most important one. Thank you very much.